Hi there, my name's Nigel Bayliss. I'm the Optimizer Product Manager. The title of this deck is What to Expect When Upgrading to Oracle 19c. It's a non-traditional slide deck in that it's directed at upgrading. So if you prefer more of a traditional list of new features for 19c, there's a link here provided for that where you can go and look in the Optimizer blog, and it covers things like what's new in Exadata and an Oracle Autonomous Database, for example. Whereas here I do want to focus on upgrading. So the categories of slides in here fit into recommendations, things that I'm recommending that you do prior or during an upgrade. Some changes that you should be aware of. They are important. They can affect things that happen, and actually they can be gotchas or surprises, things that you should know about. Then finally, some useful features on day one, things that I think you can just use straight away. That I think are just really useful and worth knowing about. I also think it's worth knowing about when the core of the optimizer has changed or how it's changed over time. So for example, if you look at Oracle Database 11G, as you would expect, there are a lot of changes made between then and 12c release 1. But as you might not be expect quite so much, is there were quite a lot of features or core feature changes like transformations and costing made between release 1 and release 2 of 12c. Whereas internally, there are fewer core optimizer changes made between 12c release 2 and then these later releases. And that was really largely because the more recent releases are focused on the autonomous features around the optimizer. So that's where a lot of changes occurred. So that does mean that if you are upgrading from 12c release 1 to 19c, you need to be at least aware of the delta. The biggest change was probably that you're going to see is probably what happened between 12c release 1 and release 2. So if you're going to read up on things or look at what new features they are, then the core things were more significant here in this phase, if you like, of the database life cycle. So bear that in mind for the upgrade. It also means that if you are upgrading from Oracle Database 12c Release 2, you're going to expect fewer plan changes, for example, going to 19c, because the core of the transformations and the costing of all that has changed less than it did if you're going from 12c Release 1. Caveats, as ever, that if you're unable to test thoroughly and you just need to upgrade a database, then minimizing change can be the best option. So in here, I'm going to recommend things you do or change, but of course you've got to always put that within the context of what you are trying to achieve. And very often, if you can't test and you just need to keep everything as stable and minimize the amount of change you made during an upgrade, then maybe the best change is no change. So keeping things as static as possible. Remember that you have optimizer features enabled as a database parameter, that you can even keep the optimizer behavior consistent between, let's say, 12c and 19c, at least at the outset. So depending on when you can test, how much you can test, the criticality of the application, you have options there if you want to take them. So be aware of the recommendations. I'm not saying that something different is right or wrong or whatever. It's ultimately your choice. Often there aren't single answers to problems, but you can use. What I'm trying to do is make you aware of these things, and then you can make your own decisions on how to best use them. So one thing I do want to say here is around adaptive optimization. This is something that came in with 12c. It has two branches, and I think very often the two branches are conflated, and there is some degree of confusion between the two. To the extent I see some DBAs overriding the default. So these are the defaults. So you have adaptive plans to true, adaptive statistics to false. And I think quite often adaptive plans is to some extent confused with adaptive statistics. However, they are quite different in their behavior. Adaptive plans are a runtime decision, whereas adaptive statistics is more of a cost-based decision. So it generally means that the runtime decision is not going to give you a lot of dynamic execution plans. You're not going to see plans changing all the time with the adaptive plans feature, whereas the adaptive statistics side of things can definitely change plans more often, and it's more appropriate in data warehouse style environments and long-running ad hoc query environments, for example. But adaptive plans we think works well for most workloads. So I think it's something you should always consider leaving at the default. So as I say, I think sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to turn adaptive plans off when I don't think that's really justified. I think it's a good feature and can definitely rescue you under certain conditions by changing, let's say, a nested loops plan to a hash join, those kinds of things. So it's useful. Reference slide. So if you do want more detail on this, there's a must note, for example, what to do around 12C release 1. I guess the thing that I would pull out from this, there are two things I'd really take from this slide. Firstly, that in 19C you will see SQL Plan directives being created. So you will see entries appearing in this view. That's normal, even if adaptive statistics is turned off. So they're gathered, but they're not going to be used to adjust plans. So just bear in mind you will see them. The other thing to bear in mind is that the 19C optimizer, the way that adaptive cursor sharing and stats feedback works, matches how it did from, say, from 11G or 12C release 2. It all behaves in a pretty consistent manner. So you can expect to use the sort of defaults for these features that you're going to be familiar with the way the optimizer works, and it works in the way that it has way back, essentially, in the way that the plans will change if cardinality misestimates are found. So some recommendations. So for want of a better phrase, best practice with system stats has changed over time. So we generally recommend now that you don't gather them. So in other words, you use the defaults. That works best for most systems. You can restore them by deleting them and restarting the database if you want to. I know that Exadata has a specific setting, of course, but generally speaking, we find that you don't need to use it and you should just continue to use the defaults. I'm not saying it's wrong to use the Exadata stats, and in fact, I was speaking to a customer recently and they get a better results with Exadata stats, but as a general principle, I would just use the defaults. That works best for most applications. The argument for this, it is a subjective argument, so you can take it or leave it to some extent. You've got to digest and what works best for you. But I think overall it's best to use the defaults. There is a discussion on the Optimizer blog about this if you want to look at it in detail and then to help you decide what's best for you. We're not removing this feature or anything. So again, in the spirit of changing little and upgrade, you can just continue to use the approach that you've always used if you want to. If you are deploying a new application in 19C and you're starting from scratch, then it becomes very sensible to consider the default system stats scenario. Histograms. Again, there's a lot of information on this slide, but there's just a few things I want to pick out, and that is estimate percent. You should be using the default auto sample size. This is important because for all the new histogram types, it has to be that value, otherwise you won't get the new histogram types. I have encountered cases where the assumption is that estimate percent of 100 is somehow better because it looks at all rows in the table, whereas in fact it's not always realized that the auto sample size does exactly that. It does look at all the rows in the table. It's just more efficient about how it processes that data after it's read. So use auto sample size, and then you will get new histogram types and everything that all the new features in stats gathering are then enabled. So you really must use auto sample size. Other things that I have encountered actually are during an upgrade process, unusual activity has been executed on a database. For example, they might be checking the min and max bound of certain identifiers stored in the database, for example. These sort of things can lead to new usage being seen by the database. It's now seeing different columns being used in queries. And if you're using for all columns size auto, that means you may acquire new histograms, which could change your execution plans. So I always think it's worth being aware of what histograms you have prior to upgrade. And I'll show you, I've got a link to some scripts where you can see that. So it's useful to have an awareness of histograms, I think, before you upgrade, because if you're generating unusual activity on your database, you can make a difference to the upgraded database without you realizing that that's what happened. Okay, so I think it's useful. There's some scripts here that you can use to actually look at what histograms you have, and in fact what extended statistics you have. And it's something you can record and keep and compare post-upgrade, for example. So I think it's just a useful thing to do. Often the recommendation is, in fact, to just let AutoStats continue to gather across the upgrade and then into the upgrade database. The only case where I would say that's different is if you're upgrading from 11G, you need to be a little bit more careful and be aware that the histograms are changing type. So your height balanced may be becoming a hybrid, for example, or top frequency, and this can change execution plans. So this can mean that if you're upgrading from 11G and you're just changing the schema over time effectively, different new histogram types, you might get the impression that your plans are very volatile for no apparent reason, whereas that's generally not the case. It's because you're changing histograms over time. So the upshot is, if you're coming from 11G, I would definitely consider just regathering everything as part of the upgrade process, so you have a clean set of fresh stats with the correct histograms on day one. So just bear that in mind. Again, a link to how to gather stats faster. So there are mechanisms you can use to make stats gathering a lot faster than you might otherwise expect. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is, again, if you're coming from 11G, the visibility of stats on global temporary tables did change in terms of default. So in 11G, gather stats will be seen by all sessions. In 12C onwards, it's private to the session by default. You can reclaim the old behavior. So this is something to bear in mind if you are coming from 11G. I hope this goes without saying. Of course, you do need to remember to regather things like dictionary stats or fixed object stats. So again, it's sort of best practice, pretty obvious, I think. Partition tables. Now, this is subject to quite a number of changes that you need to be aware of. One in particular in 19C that has caused some confusion, I think, in what's happening. What you might notice, if you have very large tables, you might notice that stats gathering, let's say you're using incremental stats, you're gathering stats on those tables, you may notice that the time to gather stats has extended, has become longer. That's because of an enhancement in the way that index stats are gathered and the way that NDK and number of distinct keys, or NDVs, have been estimated. We actually now scan the index rather than sampling. So what that means is that the estimates are much better. So in other words, they're much near 100% accurate, in fact. Not quite, they're still an estimate, but they're much closer. So in other words, you get better statistics at the global level for large tables, but it does take longer for the stats to be gathered. So if you are seeing these extended times and you want a core time back, remember that you can run a degree of parallelism when you gather stats. Again, the link to speeding up stats gathering in general. If none of this mitigation is working for you, then please let us know. This is something I'm looking out for, because I think, there are cases where this is problematic to customers. So this is something we're looking at, is what I'm trying to say. So bear it in mind, it is something that will get some attention if you're suffering from this. But I think what I'm trying to say is your first reaction is to expect it. And if it really is a problem that the extended time is giving you, then let us know about it. But otherwise, I'm hoping that you can accept that or mitigate the longer gather time, in which case then you'll get the advantage then of improved accuracy for your index stats. So now let's move on to the topic of incremental statistics maintenance. So this was introduced in 11G, and I think a lot of you will be using it. So it's a way of improving the performance of refreshing statistics on large partitioned tables. There was some changes that we made to this in 12.2, which were actually quite significant. So the way that it works is that we store some metadata against partitions, and that metadata is used and aggregated up to calculate statistics at the global or table level. In 12.2, we actually changed the way that these synopses were stored. And the reason for that is that pre-12.2, they could take a lot of space in sysorgs. And actually, for that reason, some DBAs rejected using them because they were quite large. It's dependent on things like the number of columns, the number of distinct values in those columns. So it's data dependent on how big they are. But it's something that we addressed in 12.2. And we gave them a new format. And by default, what will happen is when you gather stats, new synopses will be a lot smaller. And then the old ones will be in the older format until they're stale, and then they gradually get replaced. So this is repeat or hyperlog log. And you can, in fact, use the hyperlog log setting for this approximate NDV algorithm preference. So there's a DBMS stats preference used to set this up. And so when you gather, you can create the new smaller synopses. Then the question is, well, what do I do if I'm upgrading? Should I, let's say, from 12.1 to 19C? So this is where you are going to see the difference. Because in 12.2, if you're already using these, then upgrading to 19C, everything pretty much remains the same. So 12.1 to 12.2 or 12.1 to 19C is where you're going to see the difference. So the recommendation here is that what I would recommend you do is that you, in fact, regather all the synopses post-upgrade if you can. So that involves deleting and regathering. So again, some links about that. There's a link here that shows you the benefits of the new synopses, ways of gathering statistics more quickly. It is true, though, of course, that the pre-12.2 synopses are still supported. So you don't have to do this if you don't want to. So if you just want to keep old style and continue, at least at the beginning, you're absolutely free to do that. If you want new style on day one, my recommendation is to delete and rebuild. So that means if you're coming from 12.1, you want new style, I would delete them and then rebuild them, or as part of the upgrade process. If you're happy with the old style and it's not a priority for you to reduce the size of them, then it's not something you have to do on day one. You can leave the defaults and then new synopses will be gathered in the new format, and that's perfectly fine. Now, if you don't intend to regather or recreate synopses, then I would make sure you have this patch, the 311 patch. And that's because of some format changes that occurred inside the databases. So the side effect of if you don't apply this is that you will see when you regather stats, it can take a long time. So if you are seeing that, I would apply that patch, which means that the problem will be corrected over time. However, not instantly, in which case I do go back to the recommendation. If you want to use the new one straight away, delete and recreate. It's hopefully that's clear. So I would do that if possible. If you can't do that because the object's so big, then I would just continue to use the old style until you have an opportunity to replace them, for example, or just leave things as they are and then deal with it later. Okay, changes on day one and day one features. So first of all, you'll be aware of SQL Plan management and workload capture. So in 12.2, if you're in 12.2 above, you can capture, you can actually target specific workloads to auto capture. If you're in 12.1, you can use auto capture, and that will capture everything, all the SQL the system sees, at least reusable SQL anyway. what you need to bear in mind is with Oracle Database 19c, there is a very nice mechanism, which is the subject of another slide deck I've uploaded for this event on SPM. There is a mechanism that allows SPM to go back and look at alternative SQL execution plans and find the best ones for a given SQL statement. In autonomous database, this is fully automated, but even in Enterprise Edition, you can make use of the ability to target a SQL statement and ask the database to find a better plan for it. So the thing to bear in mind is, the key takeaway from this is that if before you upgrade, you have a repository of your previous workload SQL, you can use the features in Oracle Database 19c to retrieve those plans if you're having a performance problem with one of your SQL statements. So that means if you're in a position to keep AWR or keep your workload in a SQL tuning set, if you can do that, you're then in a position to recover those plans post-upgrade and repair any performance regressions you get. And it's pretty much a handle-turning operation. In other words, you just get SPM to figure it out for you. There's a link here that goes through the mechanism that what you can do in SPM. But the upshot is that look at preserving your workload somewhere, even if it's like a clone of your pre-upgrade database, or create a tuning set of your workload, or take a copy of AWR or upgrade in place and keep all of that. If you can keep that information in your new database, you are now in a position to say to SQL Plan Management, I have a problem query, go and find a better plan in one of these repositories, retrieve it, test that it's better, and if it is, then create a SQL Plan Baseline for it. So I recommend you look at using this exact mechanism. It's pretty powerful. On top of this, something to be aware of in 19c is there's a thing called the automatic SQL tuning set. We exposed it in 19.7. It's off by default, so now from 19.8 onwards. So it's there. It's behind the scenes. You can use it in Oracle Enterprise Edition. So it's something that you can use once you're on 19c to gather your workload information automatically. In fact, the automatic SQL tuning set was originally created to support automatic indexing. But because it's such a useful repository of information, and then we can have clients of different functionality hanging off it, we decided to expose it in Enterprise Edition. So it's something for you to read up on if you want to use it. But it is something to be aware of on day one that is available to you, but it will be off by default. So it's not something. So as long as you're upgrading to say 19.8 and onwards, it's going to be there, but it's not going to be on by default. So it's something you can look at using later on. But it's essentially a mechanism to collect your workload SQL and do things with it, including the ability to repair SQL execution plans using SPM. Brief note about 11G. This caught out some customers because they were using SQL Plan Management and they were managing all the evolution themselves. They didn't realize when upgrading to 12C that there was actually a task that now gets started. So if you're coming from 11G, I recommend using these settings. Allow the automatic evolve process in SPM to execute, but you can prevent it from auto-accepting plans on the assumption that you want to do that yourself. So this is sort of if you're coming from 11G, be aware that SPM has now an auto task that runs during the maintenance window in order to evolve execution plans. And some customers don't want that to happen. They weren't aware that it was going to happen. So just take note. Some nice features in 19C that are really, really useful, I think. So if we look at this example where I'm trying to hint a table to full scan and it's not, it's using an index. it might look easy here. I'm sure you can see it, but it's such an easy thing to get wrong in the real world. So if you've got, for example, spelling mistakes in hints or what have you, or hints are just not being used, it can be really hard to figure out why. So we now have a hint usage report. It's shown if you just use format typical actually on display XPlan, but it will only then show if there are any errors or anything, and then this little report will appear on the end. But it's really great. It shows you where there are syntax errors or where hints are not being used. So in this case, you know, it's you're not going to use my full hint because I misspelt it, things like that. It's really nice. It's a great feature, really good. Again, it can be quite specific in some cases, so it'll tell you things like you're attempting to unnest something that's not unnestable, for example. So it's brilliant. And it also has a really nice side use, in fact. And if you're aware of SQL Plan Baselines, internally, they're a set of outline hints, in fact. So if you are, a lot of cases where I see is post-upgrade, a SQL Plan baseline is not being used, and quite often this is because an underlying change has happened to the schema where maybe the database administrator is not aware of that. There is a blog post on this, so you don't need to memorize this slide, but there is a blog post in the Optimizer blog on it where you can use a couple of settings and it will give you examples of where, in this case, for example, the SQL Plan baseline is not being used by the SQL statement, but the hint report actually shows you, well, gives you a good idea why, because I'm attempting to use an index, and the reason it can't use that index is because it no longer exists. So that's a very common thing you see during an upgrade, that some reorganization has happened to the schema, and then the SQL Plan baseline can't be reproduced. So these sort of things you can see pretty straight away and eliminate those kind of cases where something has happened, like a table's been repartitioned or something like that. It's very good at spotting those. So this is a nice way to diagnose issues with SQL Plan baselines if you have any issues like that. So again, there's a link for that. Comparing execution plans is always quite difficult because they're trees. They're not, you know, it can be quite difficult to see the areas of difference in the SQL execution plan. So if you want to, for example, compare before and after on an upgraded database, you now have the ability to, for example, compare a plan that you had in AWR before the upgrade with the current plan. So it's that kind of thing you can do, and you can do that, of course, on day one. The API to do this is quite complicated looking, but the advantage of that is that it's really flexible. So you can take basically a reference plan and then compare it with lots of different sources if you want to. So definitely look at this. It's really a nice mechanism to quickly see if you've got some issue somewhere. You can say, I want you to compare the plan I've got in AWR with the plan I have today in the cursor cache and tell me what the difference is. So it's really good. And then you can spot things like, for example, where maybe there's a missing index or something like that as well. So it's a really good feature to find problems like that. Produces a report, you know, you get lots of details of sort of before and after plans. So you have a reference plan, test plans, and then ultimately we'll tell you the difference at the end of the report. So that's the sort of format it looks like. You get a bunch of different sections. So more information, you'll see that I linked the Optimizer blog quite a lot, and in fact you'll see that that gives you a jump point onto the GitHub repository that I use to store my code samples. There's the traditional new features list you can go through, link there. Also, this is the Mike Dietrich blog post about upgrading. That's extremely good. So there's lots of detailed information in there about upgrades. I'm sure most of you will look at that, but mention it anyway. You can always IM me on VLDBB, so that's what I listen on. People ask me why it's VLDBB, and that's because I have a background in very large databases. I've been doing that for years. So, and that's why, in fact, in the data warehouse and big data technologies group as well. So that's something about my background now, is where it comes from. So yeah, optimize the blog, autonomous DB blog, and the documentation, of course, and bear in mind the 30-day free trial. And having said all of that, just leaves me to say thank you very much. Hope you found that interesting, but thanks for taking a look. Bye.